Yo, it's your boy Logos. And today I want to wrap up Oversimplified's World War II series, where I'm pretty sure it's going to go into the Pacific Theater and also the fall of Nazi Germany once Operation Barbarossa starts to get pushed back after Stalingrad. I feel like both theaters, Europe and Pacific, are very much important and also very interesting. In Europe, you have mass encirclements, you have tanks fighting against each other, and you have very much mobile warfare. And also, if you want to include Africa, you have Rommel doing his Desert Fox desert campaign and Britain fighting them off. So it's very much interesting in the West, but also in the East. You have just the absolute craziness that these American soldiers are experiencing. And also Australian soldiers, British troops, all these different soldiers from all the different allied countries that was under attack by surprise by Japan. And they're just seeing the brutality, they're seeing the type of, war culture that's been brewing in Japan for the past few decades. All the things that led up to World War II. And they'll also see their ability to not really surrender. The morale is unquestionable, for good or bad, if you ask me. Their ability to, survive or keep fighting within terrible circumstances. Also at the same time, seppuku, I probably mispronounced that, but how they commit suicide instead of, surrendering, or also sometimes killing civilians instead of letting civilians surrender to American troops. There's certain stuff like that I find evil. But of course, there are also interesting, fascinating things that are happening. So of course I'm gonna pause a lot, I'm gonna talk a lot, but if you've been before, you already know what it is. So let's get into it.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for Oversimplified viewers. So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly.
The role of Italy within this war just really reminds me of Austria-Hungary for Germany in World War One. Just very incompetent. Constantly Germany have to swoop in and save them, which they'll have to go and do in Africa and also in Greece. It just really, I don't know, we're grateful for it because you don't want, fascism to be surviving, but it just kind of ironic and funny. Multiple times throughout this war, you see repeats or, I don't know, comparisons between World War One and World War Two on both sides.
He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies.
And Romania was also very important to get into the Tripartite Pact because of their oil fields, which of course the Nazi Germany needed because of their tanks, their mobile warfare, all the things that made them so deadly and so, I don't know, efficient on the battlefield. Oftentimes needed, oil and gasoline for the planes, for the tanks, for the trucks.
Specifically, Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe." And sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston. But you know what? Here, have some weapons. America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete, you take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history. And
I love how he did that.
in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out!
You're not the
With
shit
3
out.
million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready.
idiotic.
Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops.
It is absolutely crazy that Stalin somehow didn't see this coming. Because even if everybody's telling you this, even if people you don't trust, even though you're going to eventually need their support later on, telling you this, you don't trust because they're capitalists and democracies. What about the buildup of troops on your border? What about the buildup of supplies? All the things you need to, have an invasion or to do an operation. Like, come on, this stuff doesn't just pop out of nowhere. You have to make these plans. And don't you have, people on the border, your own spies? It just seems absolutely ridiculous that of all people, he trusted Hitler to not attack him too. With the different ideologies and everything, it's just ridiculous.
250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it.
If you want to know more details or events, like if you have the stomach for that type of really nasty stuff, check out World War II. It's a YouTube channel, that's the exact name, World War II. And they have a series called War Against Humanity. And they go into week by week, or at least every few weeks or so, atrocities and other stuff that happened throughout this war. And it's very, very good. The guy who narrates it, or I guess I should say hosts it, I can't think of his name right now, unfortunately. But he does a very good job. Definitely check it out.
It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came.
That's so... I don't know, just think about it. You know what happened to Napoleon. Everybody knows about General Winter. I don't know why you think they would surrender so quickly when they have an authoritarian freaking leader. Like, come on, man, this is ridiculous. Stalin don't care about his troops dying. Sometimes they don't even have weapons. They have to take weapons off of dead soldiers within the same squad as them during the same attack. So, I don't know why he would think they would surrender so quickly. But luckily, Hitler was so psychotic and idiotic that he did this. Because who knows if we could have pulled this off, like winning the war, without him messing this whole thing up. Honestly, if we did, it would have probably just take a lot more, dead bodies, unfortunately.
came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine, keep going." "We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal, keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he...
Sorry, but Hitler was a World War I veteran. He fought under leaders or people who really had no idea of the experiences of the men on the ground who had to go out and do these operations or plans from generals or political figures. But he does the same thing to his own troops. But he doing this for Germany. Think about that.
He really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning...
And a lot of the ships that did get hit or sunk, they were like older vessels, so they wasn't like top of the line or anything like that. That doesn't mean they weren't valuable, excuse me, but that doesn't mean they was like the best of the best. And that ended up going to be a big problem once you get into further naval combat.
The Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them.
Because their plan was also, because they know they couldn't win like a long, lengthy war in terms of, technology and production, but they could rely on the morale and the fighting spirit of their soldiers. So the whole idea was to catch them by surprise, use speed, and then defend these lands or defend these territories with your soldiers who won't surrender. And hopefully you can get a peace deal from that and not lose. But of course, we all know that ended up not being the case. But yeah, it was a mix of speed, but also using defense and the power of your soldiers, morale and belief in the emperor, and not surrendering at all, and believing death is better than that. And it's very insane how this was very common throughout the whole military.
For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, no, you stay.
If you want more details on this Battle of Stalingrad, Of course, there's many different, YouTube videos, documentaries, because it's a major important battle of world history, to be honest, as we all know. But also check out again, World War II, that channel I mentioned earlier about war against humanity. They have a week by week, videos, and that's the whole point of the channel mostly, to cover World War II week by week. And they, of course, they have episodes covering Stalingrad from the beginning to the end. And of course, including Operation Barbarossa and the German getting pushed back.
The entire Sixth Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels.
At this point, the war is over. There's no way Germany's going to win. But he's not going to stop throwing troops away, throwing lives away, or killing, murdering people.
In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again. And finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover.
And they couldn't, because they could never match production of the United States. Neither could Germany. And Germany has much more territory, much more industry, and experience with this type of warfare. Not to mention the territory they conquered from France and everywhere else. But either way, United States outmatched everybody when it came to producing tanks or anything else you would need for warfare. Not to mention money and supplies, food, all this stuff that went to Russia. So Japan really stood no chance from the beginning. Their whole hope was to get these lands, get these territories quick, fortify them, and hopefully the United States will give up and stop throwing their troops at these islands and want to take them away from them. That was going to happen, but that was the whole plan. And you may ask yourself, why would Japan do this to themselves? If you really want to go deeper into it, check out Dan Carlin's Supernova in the East. Very, very excellent podcast. I'm listening to it now for like the 4th or 5th time, and it's still so good. But if I want to like quickly go through and summarize it, they wanted more territory, more colonies, and China was one of their main places that they want to take over and conquer. But Britain, United States, and I think France too was, helping China fight against Japan. And then there was previous history about the West interfering in treaties and such and so forth. And Japan saw they needed these resources. They needed this territory to expand and get stronger. So they just went to war. No matter what was going to happen, they just did this because it was the best shot, even though it wasn't really going to work. And they wasted lives because of that. It's pretty damn sad.
British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for
I just want to cut in real fast to just talk about the amount of details and depth they went into to make sure this invasion went off as smoothly as possible. And I say that about tricking the Germans to where they're gonna land at. They would use things like inflatable tanks and all other types of tricks to, trick German planes or any type of scouting missions that the Germans may have to try to understand or find out where they're actually gonna land at. So if they see a whole bunch of inflatable tanks or a whole bunch of like people moving around north near Calais where they thought it was gonna land at, then they're gonna put more troops there. But all that detail and all that extra work paid off because it made the landing at least a lot, or at least a little bit easier to defend against or be successful. And I think that should be admired because that happens often throughout history. Great generals would do very strenuous tasks or put their army through great strenuous tasks for the sake of a victory that probably wouldn't be possible, or at least a lot more pyrrhic or bloody compared to if they didn't do that. Like Hannibal going through the Alps, or Napoleon using certain tactics to trick different armies and get them separated. It's just common things you will see them do.
For a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out. One to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to...
Just a little fun fact. The word kamikaze comes from divine wind, which is a reference to a hurricane from my memory that took out the Mongol fleet when they tried to invade Japan twice, I think. And I think that's where the original name of the word come from, or at least everywhere I've heard or read and studied about it from. So that's just a little fun fact. And the United States, their island hopping campaign was very efficient and I think very well planned out. Deciding to not attack every single island, but attack strategic ones that you could also starve out the other islands and cut off Japan from providing food and ammunition, all the things they need to survive, was very, very smart. And it just proves you don't have to attack everyone head on. You can always just attack their lines of communication. And when you have the best naval power in the world, especially when you consider aircraft carriers, it makes it very easy to cut off the sea lanes to these different islands that are, behind some American control islands. Like, for example, where my mouse is at the bottom left corner, if you can just control this, you can stop ships from coming here and reaching these men and providing food and sustenance to them. Thanks to your planes, airfields that are on ships, or even on these islands. A lot of these islands was used and controlled by Japan at the start of their invasion to put little planes, or airships on, to send out planes to control greater, circumference or areas of territory that could help defend it against Allied attacks.
To make a choice: either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage.
It wasn't at your advantage like a couple years ago, or at least a long time ago. Once you lost at Midway, but honestly, once you did this from the beginning, you wasn't going to win. The Soviet Union didn't even attack you yet, and at that point you already lost. Here's the thing with the Emperor in this war. It's a lot of debate about how much responsibility he actually had, because some people say, or there is like this notion that he could have stopped this war at any point because he is the Emperor and he's supposed to be like a god figure to the Japanese people at this time period. But the fact that he didn't do anything until after the nuclear bombs, but still Japanese troops are fighting and dying over and over again, is just insane. And the whole idea about him being like a god emperor and the culture within Japan at this time is exemplified when you hear the story about Japanese troops who would still kill locals and like fight as if they were still at war, like World War II was still happening, long after the war actually ended. And I can't remember some of these guys' names, but places like the Philippines or other small islands around this time period that Japan once owned or controlled, they were still fighting and going at war, or at least killing locals, innocent people, because they didn't believe the war was over. And in their mind, the only way the war would be over is if Japan conquered the world, or won what they were supposed to win with Germany, or if Japan didn't exist anymore. Because the whole idea of surrendering was not an option.
After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me. And your app is doing really well. And this quesadilla you made is to die for. How'd you learn to do all this stuff? I used the link in the description to get 2 months of Skillshare for just 99 cents. Wow.
Okay, I'll wrap it up there because this video is years old, so the link don't even work. So it don't matter. But I appreciate Oversimplified for making this video. I love his content. And if you want me to cover the Cold War, I'll definitely do that. I'm really looking forward to doing the Punic Wars and Napoleon, because Napoleon is probably my second favorite general of all time, just a little bit behind Julius Caesar. And the Punic Wars, I love Hannibal, his maneuvers, so being able to talk about that would be really fun. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Like, share, subscribe. It's your boy Logos, and I'll see you next time. Peace.